This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
When we don't tell people that they're dying, when we aren't honest and upfront and transparent, we're robbing them of the opportunity to say their goodbyes, to do those final things they want to do, to have conversations, to apologize, to forgive. Because if we're not saying, you are dying, this is the end, and what can we do? What are your goals? What do you need? Because it should be all about the patient.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. My guest today is Pastoral Thanatologist, Hospice Chaplain, and Death Midwife Joelle Johns. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode of The Heart of Hospice is sponsored by Odonata Care. When caring for a loved one on hospice, support becomes essential. Introducing the Care Plan, a path to comfort for the hospice patient, a supportive guide by experienced hospice nurses Nancy Hireman and Brenda Kazire. Nancy and Brenda invite you to experience all that the Care Plan has to offer. Be sure to check out their free library of care videos on thecareplan.net or on YouTube. Purchase your copy of the Care Plan today at thecareplan.net. This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is sponsored by the Tree of Life Conference by International Doula Life Movement. Join IDLM at the Tree of Life Conference in San Antonio, Texas, November 1st through the 4th. The Tree of Life Conference is more than just workshops and seminars. It's an opportunity to connect, learn, and renew your commitment to compassionate care. Attendees will hear from expert speakers like end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes and Death Deck co-creator Lisa Paul. Visit internationaldoulalifemovement.com for more details.
Very different guest today, a pastoral thanatologist. I had never even heard of a pastoral thanatologist until I became acquainted with this lady. Reverend Joelle Johns is my guest today. She's an ordained minister, a clinical chaplain, and a pastoral thanatologist. She's also a death midwife and a grief counselor. Joelle started her career in human services and the helping professions as a psychiatric social worker and has worked in both inpatient facilities and community settings. Through the years, she's worked in geriatric social work, elder guardianship, skilled nursing administration, and she's also worked extensively with hospice and nonprofit organizations to provide trauma-informed resources to the community. She's an educator. She is a learner. She's growth-minded. You're really going to enjoy my conversation with her. Her passion is the psychospiritual meaning of death and dying. And we really took a deep dive into all of this as it pertains to advanced care planning and those delicate, intimate conversations and the importance of having them early. She has a different take on the phrase, live like you're dying. And we had an interesting conversation about that, which apparently Joelle has all the time because she says she talks to her kids nonstop about death and dying. Joelle thinks that we rob people of quality time if we're not honest with them about their prognosis, about how much time they have left. Joelle also shared her mentor's wisdom on how to be human in a hospice world. She's got a terrific quote there you'll hear. She says that she learns about her patients through their environment, where the patient lives, wherever the patient calls home. As far as her own advanced care planning, she says she plans to enjoy the music of John Denver and that mashed potatoes with gravy will be part of her end-of-life plan for her comfort feedings. You can connect with Joelle via email at revjoellejohns@gmail.com. That's RevJoelleJohns@gmail.com. You can check that out in the show notes after you listen to the show. Here's my conversation with Reverend Joelle Johns. Joelle, it's so great to have you on the show. Welcome to the Heart of Hospice.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, Helen. Thank you.
You know, one of these days I'm going to find a way to do in-person interviews with everybody because your smiling face is wonderful, but it would be so nice to be in person with people.
It would be.
So I know you a little bit. We've known each other for a few years. We've served on some committees together. But just so my listeners get to know you, I'm going to do an icebreaker question, and I picked a special one for you.
Oh, boy.
So, what is your biggest pet peeve?
My biggest pet peeve?
Yes.
In life, my biggest pet peeve?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm going to leave it to you to filter this as you see fit.
Okay. For some reason, what immediately jumped into my head is when people lie. And like when I know that they're lying, that is a huge pet peeve of mine. And my kids will tell you I drive them nuts because I'm like, that's not true. That's not true either. You know what I mean? And I'll be like, just let's keep it coming until we land on what is actually true. So I have this like sense of, because I'm a terrible liar. So I think I'm extra sensitive to it. So I don't even bother trying, which, is for good or for bad. So I think when people are dishonest, like put it right out there, it just drives me absolutely crazy.
I get that. Do you have teenagers, Joelle?
I do. Well, I shouldn't say I have one teenager now. The other two are in their early 20s, but they'll tell you that mom can sniff out a lie from a mile away.
Oh, that's like a superpower for a mother. That's pretty cool.
It comes in handy.
I like it. That was a good question for you. I'm glad I picked that one for you.
Yeah, thanks. I always like thinking about how it applies to my own family too.
I'm sure they think about it, how it applies to them as well.
Not too often.
We've got a lot of good stuff we're going to talk about today because you are a very well educated and still being educated woman. You're doing some amazing work, and we've never had a pastoral thanatologist on the show before.
There are so many of us. How did that get past you?
Like all 8 of you, I think. So yeah. I want to dive into that and talk about that. You're going to have to educate me as we educate the listeners because I'm not familiar with this either. So what is a pastoral thanatologist and what kind of work do they do?
Well, if you just break that title apart, thanatology is the study of death and dying. And along with that, what is involved in terms of the grief, bereavement, mourning, all of the things that go with loss by death. And pastoral is the part where I really lean into, it is my ministry to work in end of life and to work with folks that are grieving. So my focus in the world of thanatology is the psychospiritual effect it has on people, either the dying or those who have lost people. But I also am really interested, and this is sort of where I'm leaning into my doctorate work on how chaplains and other people in this field and thanatologists like myself can apply things we're learning to bigger parts of society so that we can start having these conversations before medical crises and before people are ending up coming into hospice or having some of these life challenges that are, quite frankly, if we don't have a way to deal with these things healthfully, that sort of really kind of start to break apart all the layers of our psyches. Probably a long answer.
No, that's the perfect answer. There's a lot to unpack in that because upstream conversations are a huge issue, a huge stumbling block for those of us in the healthcare industry in the United States. And I have a saying that I made up. An ambulance is a terrible place to do advanced care planning.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That's a great say. Can I steal that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. $5 every time you use it.
Awesome.
But
I can do that.
It's totally true. If you wait to the last minute, it's kind of like that. My grandmother used to say, if you're on time, you're late. If you're early, you're on time. You have to do it ahead of time. So we like to wait until we're exhausted, sick, financially strapped, overburdened, overwhelmed, grieving, depressed, mentally distracted,
tapped.
and then we want to make huge life and death decisions, literally life and death decisions.
Yeah.
What kind of plan is that?
It's not. It's really, really bad planning. And it's something I see over and over and over again. Why aren't we, when we, let's take dementia, for example. Dementia is of most types, and I'm not a medical professional, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is terminal.
Yes.
So usually when someone gets to the point where they're going into a skilled nursing facility, we know how this is going to end. So when we're doing that admission, why not have some people there, if the admissions people are uncomfortable with the conversation, like a chaplain perhaps, or a nurse that's really good at having those conversations, and I know many, that can sit with the family and start that conversation then. Like when your loved one declines, because we know that they will. What are the markers? Like what are the goals? And we can shift the goals as time goes on, but at what point are we going to switch to comfort measures? Do you know what I mean? How many times do we want to send this sweet, frail person out to the hospital over and over and over again? Why don't we have that conversation up front?
Yeah.
And then let's take that even further back, because I've started doing work in senior centers. Let's have it before you're even admitting anybody to a skilled nursing facility.
Wow. It's a crazy concept. Let's have the conversation about your end of life wishes while you're still healthy enough to make them and to think it through.
Right.
And you can have more than one conversation.
Absolutely. I would like to have the conversation a lot. If death, the fact that we are finite beings doesn't inform us and make us behave better, because I don't always think that it does, but I think if we could lean into that a little bit more, maybe we would make better choices along the way before we're even getting to the end of life conversation. But that's a heavy lift. So I'm going to stay in my lane.
Well, but I think that's a good point. We're very aware of it. There's all kind of conversation around, everybody dies, because we talk about having a bucket list. We talk about, live like you're dying. Well, so if you're going to live like you're dying, shouldn't your advanced care planning be part of that? Tim McGraw didn't put that in that song.
It's funny that you say that, because for some people, and now in this, kind of our social media saturated world where like all the photos we kind of live so publicly, but do a lot of people, live like you're dying to a lot of people is like, yes, take the trips and do all that wonderful stuff. Of course, make memories. I think that is fantastic. But also, how is it informing how you treat other people? How you forgive? How, some of the choices you make, maybe where you put some of your donation money, maybe where you show up in your community. Can we do a little bit of that living like we're dying too?
Yeah.
In addition to, we're in a society, we have to look out for each other, and we're not doing a very good job right now. And
No.
I don't want to even go down that road.
Yeah, that's a whole different podcast.
Yeah.
A whole different podcast.
We can do better, though.
We can.
We can do better.
And that's our goal, is to maybe incite some conversations and spark some ideas for anybody who's listening, to make you guys think about your own advanced care planning, especially if you're a healthcare professional, because I know from my own personal experience that healthcare professionals, even end-of-life workers, are just as bad as everybody else when it comes to having those conversations, because I am just as bad. I have to tell on myself. And it's not for a lack of trying. I have found that my family's very resistant to having those conversations with me. Very resistant to it. Yeah. Being told, that's not going to happen to you. I basically have one that's probably going to have me stuffed and set on the end of the couch for perpetuity. It's hard to have this conversation. So we can acknowledge that it's hard. I never want to sugarcoat it and act like it's not a big deal to have that conversation, because it is.
And it is. It absolutely is. And what's interesting, though, is how it really can help, because, and I'll use my own example. And first and foremost, I talk about death with my children all the time. I drive my children crazy with it. They're so sick of listening to me. So my son, who is going into medicine, and he wants to do pediatric, either oncology or neurology, he works at Moffitt, and he called me the first day he saw somebody die while he was doing CPR on them.
Oh, wow.
It really impacted him. But because we have some language, and I've given him, afforded him, I guess that what is the word I'm looking for? Like the taxonomy, is that the word I'm looking for?
Right.
To talk about what he was seeing and what he was feeling, and he was able to talk about it. And he was equal parts, affected and intrigued, and but it wasn't as scary because it was something that he and I had talked about and sort of. But when my mother died, and my mother died in her, basically in her sleep, about a year ago, this past October, she and I used to talk about it all the time. And she used to say, "Don't you dare." And I mean, we're talking threat. And she was a nurse too, by the way, a psychiatric nurse. She was a fantastic
that
woman.
figures.
Yeah, she was a hoot. And she said, "Don't you dare ever let me be in a hospital with tubes and wires and being kept on that." And to back out of that even further, and I'm going to circle back to that, but her mother, my mom's an only child, and she had to make all the decisions with her mom, who died of lymphoma. And it was very hard on her because she was making decisions by herself, and there was no plan written out. And she had to kind of say, when they wanted to put my grandmother on a vent, she said no, because she's not going to get up and walk out of here, right?
Right.
And they said no. So she said, "Don't do it." And that was probably the hardest thing she ever did, and the most compassionate thing she ever did for my grandmother. But then when my mom herself died, my dad had, as he should be, he was, lots of what ifs, because it's a natural reaction. What if I'd found her earlier? What if I'd gone in?
Right.
Because like a lot of older folks, they don't sleep in the same room, snoring, getting up to pee, all that stuff. Sorry, Dad. But I said, "Dad, had you done that, and had you called 911 and they came and did CPR, Mom was not in the best health. What do you think would have been, how do you think that would have unfolded?"
Yeah.
And he sat with it for a while, and he's like, "She wouldn't have liked that." He said because they would have brought her to the hospital. And I just shut up and let him sort of take it out to each next level. And she wouldn't have been the same. And would there have been brain damage?
Right.
I don't know. My mother used to joke, "If I end up in one of these places, she was diabetic, you better make me a cake with pure sugar frosting and just bring it in, leave it with me.
Yeah. And let me go.
And I'm going to refuse." Yep. I'm going to just death by cake.
There are worse things, I think.
Well, right. So, but that helped I know that my mother would not have wanted all the stuff.
Yeah.
So that gave me a sense of peace. And I don't think people realize that when they do their advanced care planning and when they see things start to unfold and they say, we talked about this, I know exactly what my loved one wants.
Right.
It is so freeing to be able to do that.
It truly is. You know, I want to touch on the only child thing because this is something that's come up a couple of times for me just in this past week. I did a session with a young woman who is an only child, caring for two parents. And one of the first death I was ever present for in a home in hospice was on my first day in the field. It's a crazy story, but the patient, the woman who died, had one child, and he was a very quiet man, a pharmacist, and he said, I have never felt so lonely in my entire life. He said, this is a terrible time to be an only child because these decisions are all mine. He said, I didn't know it would be like this. So anyway, that's kind of obscure chasing a rabbit, but I wanted to touch on that because I think it does affect a lot of caregivers who become decision makers for a parent. Yeah.
It does. And I see the agony. I see it in my role as a hospice chaplain. I see the agony. I see the family infighting it can cause because, you know, if you have 3 children, you have 3 people that are have different ideas.
Sure.
If it wasn't talked about.
Yeah.
A physician friend of mine, I went to visit him at his office and his father had just died. And he was, you know, understandably sad, but also so grateful because his father had laid out everything. All of his wishes were laid out. How he wanted it, you know, to every detail of how he wanted to be celebrated after the fact, but all of like the scenarios were addressed. So there was no question of what to do. And just seeing how peaceful that made him, you know what I mean? It's just another example of when you have the conversations and there's something to be gained from that for everybody.
I think advanced care planning speaks to quality of life for both the patient and the caregiver or decision maker loved one. I also think that it speaks to comfort, to palliation, psychospiritual. I've never thought about it that way, but when you look at it, I definitely think it contributes to both of those things, to quality of life and comfort both.
Absolutely. I think when we don't tell people that they're dying, when we aren't honest and upfront and transparent, we're robbing them of the opportunity to say their goodbyes, to do those final things they want to do, to have conversations, to apologize, to forgive. Because if we're not saying, you are dying, this is the end, and what can we do? What are your goals? What do you need? Because it should be all about the patient. What are your goals? And if their goals are to see a grandchild and maybe they can't fly anymore, well, we have technology. Let's make these things happen. Let's see what we can do. But if we're not telling them and they think that being readmitted to the hospital for another infusion, another tap, another surgery, a 98-year-old diabetic that's getting his leg removed and he'll come back and skill at the facility.
Yes.
What are we doing?
Yeah. Is that the goal?
What are we doing?
What is the goal for that?
Is that his goal?
Mm-hmm.
Whose goal is that?
Yeah, so maybe that's the better question. Not what's the goal, but whose goal is that? Yeah. I also think we have a way of saying to patients and families, what's your goal? Instead of saying it in a way that communicates a little bit better on their level, which is, what do you want to get out of this? What do you expect that you will get out of this? Yeah.
And I think a bigger question, and I'm gonna pull this blatantly from some of my favorite doctors, Atul Gawande and BJ Miller. I fangirl over palliative care physicians, which is kind of silly, but I love their work. And they both say one of the first things they ask patients, and I love this, and I use this, is what is your understanding of where you're at right now, medically, in your disease process? What is your understanding?
Yes. And, by the time they get to where we're talking about palliative care and we're talking about end of life, in our heads, I think healthcare providers expect people to have processed everything. They're on board. They understand everything. They know where the diagnosis is going. They understand 5 different specialties that are, everything they're being told. And I don't think that's true. I think it's not even like drinking from the fire hose. I think it's like being shot at with a water cannon for most people.
Yeah.
They don't speak the language to begin with, and then they're thrust into an industry, which could be another conversation. I love it that we have health and we have care, but we're handled by a business, a huge structure. Those two things aren't very compatible in my view. But we expect them to have this understanding. And I don't think people come necessarily to the end of their lives and end of treatment really understanding everything that's going on. I think it's just too much.
It is. And then I to take that one step further, how do we fix that? So do they need to know and I find, and I love doctors. I'm a big fan. I have specialists I need to see too.
Right.
But I find that they kind of lean into clinical when they're uncomfortable with telling somebody that they're dying. And our system is based on saving kind of at all costs. It's a failure if they don't. And I nothing could be further from the truth. And I know we romanticize the good death in hospice, but what else can we call it? I mean, we need to hang our hat on something. We have to have a goal, as clinicians and as practitioners that we want for the patient too. You know what I mean? Something that overarches why we do what we do, why we get up in the morning and go to work.
Right.
But I think if we could break down, which is why I love to ask them, what do you understand about what's happening? Because sometimes it's so far afield from what the diagnosis is and what, I hate to use the word prognostication, but let's face it, it happens.
Right.
And what that number, air quotes, is of time left.
Yeah.
And at what point do we say, yes, you could have that surgery. It's going to make you miserable and you're not necessarily going to get more time. You know what I mean? How transparent do we need to be? And should we be? And should we owe them to be?
Yeah. I think those conversations, you talk about the saving, we're trained to save. I think it's more than just saving a life. I think it's also about saving time and saving money. And that's tacky, right? Yeah. I'm telling on us, but it's absolutely true.
It's so true.
Yeah, it is true.
The Care Plan by Odonata Care has revolutionized the hospice experience by improving the standard of care. This booklet provides education and support to the patient and the patient's caregiver. The Care Plan provides step-by-step directions for caregiving tasks like cleaning or turning a patient. Hospice agencies utilize the Care Plan to support caregivers and to provide critical information in the moment when it's needed. This helps reduce after-hours calls and gives hospice staff more time for patient care. The Care Plan's simple design empowers caregivers by giving them the tools they need to feel confident caring for their loved one. Odonata founders Nancy Hireman and Brenda Kazire also offer a free library of care videos to provide even more support for caregivers. Videos can be found on thecareplan.net or on YouTube. The Care Plan is available in English or Spanish and can be purchased on the Odonata website at thecareplan.net. It's available in paper and digital formats, and bulk purchases are also available for agencies. Purchase your copy of the Care Plan today at thecareplan.net. In a world where compassion and community are needed more than ever, the International Doula Life Movement presents the Tree of Life Conference. Join IDLM November 1st through the 4th in San Antonio, Texas for an extraordinary experience in end-of-life care. The Tree of Life Conference is not just an event, it's a movement towards making a positive impact. Attendees will hear from expert speakers including award-winning end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes, Lisa Paul of the Death Deck, Brenda Kazire and Nancy Hireman of Odonata Care, and end-of-life advocate Helen Bauer, host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Tree of Life Conference is more than just workshops and seminars. It's an opportunity to connect, learn, and renew your commitment to compassionate care. This event is made possible by the team at International Doula Life Movement, who believes in the power of empathy, education, and making a difference in the world. Don't miss out on this transformative experience. Join IDLM at the Tree of Life Conference in San Antonio, Texas from November 1st through the 4th. Visit internationaldoulalifemovement.com for more details and secure your spot today.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. In your work as a chaplain, as a pastoral thanatologist, you do grief and bereavement work, right? And of course that starts from the minute you meet the patient. It doesn't have to start when the death actually occurs, right? We know that grief starts way before that. You identify yourself as something you call a grief walker. That's an interesting term. What does that term mean for you?
Well, it's kind of layered because grief is sort of that club we're all going to have a membership to.
Right.
Whether we like it or not. And we can try to control every avenue of our life, but we're all going to belong. So we're kind of all walking with this grief. And one of the models of grief work that I have always loved and really resonated with me, Alan Wolfelt, the companioning model, where you walk beside, because people have stories, and holding space for those stories and the stories about the love and of the loss without an agenda to fix or even teach. There's a time and a place for everything, and grief can't be fixed, nor should it be fixed. And we can get into that. But I like to walk beside people. So back in, I think it was like late 2000s, there's a gentleman named Stephen Jenkinson who has a documentary. He's a Harvard-trained theologian guy that doesn't really never pursued it as a profession, but works a lot with dying. And he wrote a book called Die Wise, but he has a documentary called Grief Walker. And that's when it kind of all clicked too, because whether you're working with the bereaved of a person that died or the dying themselves, the grief, I find it's almost like a bolus of grief when you're faced with that terminal illness because of all the things you are not going to be able to do anymore. And so that it permeates so much of our journey, and we don't honor it at all. We are really lousy at it in this society. And I don't mean to sound like I'm like down on us. I'm not. I see lots of beauty in the world and lots of beauty at the end too. But I think being able to walk beside grief and hold space for that is where I find that title. Because for some reason, I don't know if it's my own makeup or how I compartmentalize my life, but I can hold space for that fairly well without feeling overwhelmed. And I think it's because I see grief as a necessary part of our journey. It's a necessary thing. It's a natural state that we just don't we don't give a whole lot of, it's like, isn't she over that yet? And
Right. It's
move
been
on.
long enough. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, aren't we born natural grievers? I mean, I think that's who we are as humans.
Yeah.
Death and loss. I mean, because grief comes from all sorts of different sources, not just the death of someone.
Absolutely.
There's so much different loss. I think naturally we are born to grieve. It's a natural human emotion. And as end-of-life workers, chaplains, nurses, aides, volunteers, physicians, nurse practitioners, aren't we all professional grievers in a way as we observe and companion all these folks?
Yeah.
We're professional grievers. It's not as if we're immune to that. We have our own
No.
personal lives, and who knew, right? We are
Yeah,
humans.
right.
Being human in a hospice world, that is who we are. But we also carry some secondary grief, which is very normal and actually a very healthy component of someone who works in end-of-life work. Because if you don't have some of that, you're missing something, a component of empathy, of the heart you need to come to this work with. Because if you don't at least feel some of their pain,
Oh, yeah.
I truly think there's something missing.
I agree. And there's one chaplain that I loved. And when I first volunteered for hospice back in, I think it was 2009 or 2007, I can't remember. But there was this little petite, tiny little chaplain, and she was so good at what she did. And I shadowed her, and she let me, bless her heart. She's still my spiritual friend to this day and kind of my mentor. And I unload a lot on her. Hi, Reverend Carol. And she once said to me, I said, how do you not just get in your car and sob? She goes, I do. And I said, how do you not cry in the room when the grief is so palpable? And she said, I do. I just can't be the one crying the hardest. She said, that's not okay.
That's right.
She's like, you can cry and you can absolutely show empathy and you can be present to that family and you can weep for the loss and for their hard time. You just shouldn't be the one that's like wailing louder than everybody else.
Exactly. Because then you've become one of the grieving family, and that is not who you are.
No.
And it makes us ineffective if we're overengaged.
Exactly.
And we become one of the grieving group. We're no longer effective. And it's not a healthy place for an end-of-life worker to be anyway.
No, and
You've gone into a bad space.
Right. We cannot, if I set up my relationship with a patient to be attached to them, I'm in for a world of hurt.
Right.
Sometimes there are definitely people that kind of breach the wall and that kind of get into my heart. And those are harder. But it's kind of what I signed up for is that I do have to keep a professional sort of distance, but it's such an intimate space.
It is.
So it takes a lot of intention.
It is, especially for community-based care. When you go into someone's home, there is an intimacy just with stepping into their living space. You've stepped into their family dynamics, their memories, their mementos, all the clutter that's on their nightstand, the pictures on the walls, the military medals that came from their dad, the folded flag from a funeral, things like that. That is an extremely intimate relationship, and that's before you even have a conversation with people.
Right. And I think if you're like me, when you do go into someone else's space, you take in everything.
Yeah.
And you do it quick because it's something I'm looking for where there might be areas of deep spiritual pain. Mm-hmm. So I try to take in as much as I can. And that includes how I see the family interacting with each other, body language, like sort of going into their space, sort of kind of blending into it for a little bit is is so helpful, I find, and helping patients in particular, and their families, of course, to sort of lean into what feels most urgent to address and sort of unpack. In my role, in my chaplain role. In death midwifery, you get a whole other opportunity there because there's not the same time element necessarily as we have in hospice.
Right. But that's part of our assessment, Joelle. Don't you think that's part of our assessment? Because we're looking to see, is the environment safe? Is it comfortable? Mm-hmm. Do they have everything they need? And it helps us to know the patient in a much more intimate, much more robust way than if we see them in a controlled environment that belongs to us, a hospital room. Mm-hmm. Even in a facility, a long-term care facility, that's not really the patient's personal space. It is to a certain extent, but mostly it's a facility room.
Yeah.
Yeah. So stepping into a patient's home, I think that's a very unique aspect of community-based end-of-life care.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I like home patients kind of for that reason, and not as a preference, but just sort of as a different kind of way to exercise some of my skills, is because I do get to see them in their own element and sort of in their own milieu that they've been in for years and years. Yeah. And how they are in that space. I do have some of my skilled patients, my skilled nursing long-term care facility patients, have their rooms decked out, so you can at least get a sense of who they are. And I love to look at pictures and hear all about the stories of each person in the pictures, and that's still a delight.
Yeah, all the drawings from the great grandkids, that are just this scribble on a piece of paper.
Right. And are they Nana? Are they Gigi? Are they Grandma? Are they Gammy?
Are you the Mimi? Yeah. But that's how we get to know our people. But there is an important boundary. When you enter their home or their living space, it does not become your home as an end-of-life worker. And that boundary is really hard to keep. I mean, I've had my moments with patients that were like that.
It is. And I think we learn in ministry, I know this, we learn that there's a huge power differential to always be mindful of. And that's why I never want to over insert myself in a space. And to never, it should never, ever, ever be about the person in the room that's representing hospice. And the reason that I love hospice so much is it's so egalitarian in terms of the team input. Because what the aide tells me is just as important as what the nurse is telling me, is just as important as what the social worker is saying, and just as important as what the chaplain is bringing. You know what I mean? So right. I love IDT because I love that we all sort of talk. And it's also a place where if we do see somebody that is, as you say, getting a little too overfamiliar in the home environment, we can sort of say, can we help you with that? Because it feels like you might be struggling to kind of keep in your lane. And right. But it's hard because what we do is so tender.
And isn't that what makes it so special?
It is. It is. People say, oh, God bless you for what you do. And I'm like, I get to do this. Do you know what I mean? Like people let me be in this sacred space. I feel honored.
But the school of thought is either you're a big weirdo.
There's that. There's definitely
right.
The big
you're
weirdo.
Morbid. How could you possibly? How can you still walk upright and laugh if you're dealing with dying people all day long? How can you touch dead bodies? Things like that. Because I've gotten that type of reaction. But then you get this, oh, you're an angel and you're special and it takes a special person, which is a very nice compliment to have from people. But I even have a tendency to say, no.
Yeah.
I don't feel special. I know the work is special. It's a privilege for me. But sometimes my skill is getting to the car without crying until I get there.
Right.
Or having a strong stomach.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely part of it. Yeah. And I have a pretty dark sense of humor too, which, sometimes I get it's like, I have to de-stress too. We need outlets too. When you work in this particular part of the industry. But, before the Civil War, we laid out people in our front parlor,
Yeah.
And so it wasn't that what seems so over there was part of life.
It was everybody.
Why do I have to be a specialist to do this? Why did I have to have all this training and studying and learning about death and death practices and end of life and all the stuff that goes around it when it's as natural as being born?
So do you think we actually do any better now that we've basically industrialized death? We've monetized it. So do you think we're better as grievers? Because those people weren't educated. They were doing what came naturally. Dad died. We laid him on a door. He was cleaned, washed. We had the friends and family file through the house, through the living room.
Right.
Or death room, right? The funeral parlor, because that's where he was laid out, was in the family home. And so they were just consoling each other and doing what seemed natural, humanly natural and culturally natural. So with all this evolving that we've done, are we actually any better at it? Because we've disconnected ourselves and we've sterilized it and cleaned it up.
I think the opposite.
Yeah.
I think the opposite.
I would agree. I think we've dehumanized it.
We have. And I think we're very poor translators of the divine and of these sort of life cycles and things that are really gorgeous, and they kind of make us unique. If we didn't love, we wouldn't feel bad when somebody was gone. Or to your point, when you were talking about it's not always death, when you get a divorce, it would be like, you know what I mean? Oh, well.
Yeah, you just keep going.
Another day. Yeah. But I think because we love, which is, let's face it, as far as we know, pretty unique to our species, that's why it hurts so much. So I don't know when we lost that ability to be closer to these divine aspects of our nature, the birth, the death. I don't know where we went so sideways, where it became a for-profit thing.
I like to think that we're unlearning a lot of these things. We've had so many advancements in modern medicine and healthcare. I think maybe it's because I run around with a bad crowd, right? We talk about death and dying and improving death care all the time, right? It's just a normal conversation for me every single day. But I hear the conversation getting bigger. It's getting louder. It's sort of a call to action. We need change. We see that we need change. The pandemic has shown us what's vitally important: connection and ritual and recognition and support and community and story. We've seen those things. So I do feel like it's a pattern of unlearning. And we definitely are having conversations about what's wrong. I mean, you and I have talked about the underbelly of everything today.
Sure.
But I think we're unlearning a lot. That's my hope anyway.
I think so. And I love what's happening with the Death Midwife. I went through 2 different trainings for that as well, because I love some of the areas that death midwives can lean into, death doulas, end-of-life doulas.
Yes.
And that they're sort of bringing the conversation back too. So I love watching that kind of blossom, because back when I did it, I think I did my first one back in 2018. It was still just kind of a little whisper, and it's growing louder. And I like that. And I think we need that. And like I said, part of my desire is to kind of grow chaplains into community spaces to also start having these conversations, because we are capable of doing it by and large. Maybe a discomfort with public speaking, but then host it as a little informal group.
Yeah.
And, a chat. coffee, let's talk about death. And death cafes were doing it for a while. And then, I don't know, I don't hear as much about those anymore. I do know that there's some like pub stuff like you can do over beers, like Death Over Drafts, I think is one of them, which is great.
Yeah, that's it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Or the Silent Book Club of Death. I've seen those where people get together and they're reading books about death.
Yeah. Well, and I'm the queen of death books. Just ask my children. I would love to see us though actually hitting, if I went over to the public library, this is just a guess. But if I went over to the public library and said, I want to host, some kind of talk on death, I probably wouldn't get the same people. When I go to do it at a senior center, I get told, well, a little of a hard sell to talk about death here.
Yeah, you're bringing us down. Yes. Yeah.
Bringing them all down. And I find that kind of fascinating. So when I do get, past that and can talk with people, I really try to use humor. To sort of, again, that dark sense of humor to just kind of get people talking and thinking, because I want to just sort of plant myself in their head that start thinking about this now. You're healthy. You're here. You just played pickleball this morning. Good for you. But what's happening, 5 years from now? Or God forbid, someone has like a stroke, an accident, the once you start that cascade, are you ready? Or are you going to leave your family trying to figure it out?
Yeah.
And the biggest hurdle is always like the DNR.
Oh my gosh.
Dun, dun, dun.
Oh, yeah.
I love the MOLST. That is one of my favorite. MOLST. Here in Massachusetts, we use MOLST for the medical order for life-sustaining treatment. And I love that you can be so specific. And people are afraid once they fill that out, like it's going to go to some cosmic thing in the sky that cannot be revoked.
You're on the big list.
Yeah, that's the other thing is like, if you start thinking about it, if you put your advanced directives on paper, something's going to happen. You know what I mean? That kind of magical thinking.
Yeah. Or what if you have a conversation? So let's make it a little more concrete. You talk to your doctor and you say, I want to talk to you about my end of life plans. Does that somehow signify to him that if you were to have a stroke, that you don't want to be treated?
Yeah, that's the fear.
Would that influence, unconsciously, would he, at that point, would you have created a bias within him, a viewpoint that says, well, her perspective is, her wishes are, so we're not going to pursue this. We're not going to pursue treatment. And I do think that people still have a little bit of this superstition. If you talk about it, somehow it precipitates out. I would tell you that I have been talking about death and dying and end of life for 15 years. I'm still here.
Yeah, same. And I even got hit by a car.
Yeah.
and just kind of bounced.
Yeah. It doesn't protect you, but...
No, but it didn't take me out
but we're
either.
not gone yet.
No.
Yeah.
No, but it's important.
It is. So I want to ask you a personal question about your advanced care plan.
Okay.
Can you share something that's unique about your advanced care plan, or something that's personal, something quirky? Will you share that with me and my listeners?
Well, if we're talking about sort of the bare advanced care plan, my husband and I talk about this all the time, and I have edits.
Of course.
But my thing is, and he knows this, is that if there's a medical crisis that because I hate the idea of being on a vent.
Ooh,
that terrifies me. So, I'm like more afraid of the life-sustaining treatment
than you are of dying.
Yeah. So I always say, if I'm in an accident, if I were in an accident tomorrow, I would want, all the things because I'm in good health. You know what I mean? I don't want necessarily to have, to just be like, well, she was in an accident. I'll just tell the chips fall. And I think that's what people think. My husband knows if there's a medical crisis that I need to get from point A to point B and it needs to be all this stuff, to do all the stuff and then reassess. if my brain damage is such that I'm probably not going to be, then no. Then don't keep me alive for that. But for my vigil plan, if I am fortunate enough to have a slower decline and be able to sort of slowly die at home, which is hopefully everybody thinks that's their plan. There would be a lot of John Denver being played, and I am not ashamed to admit that I would want.
It's like a guilty pleasure to say you like John Denver, right?
It is a little bit. I would want John Denver, and while I can still eat mashed potatoes with really salty gravy.
Oh, yum. So I live in the South. You want cream gravy or brown gravy?
Brown gravy. I'm from the Northeast, so we do it a little thin and watery up here, but salty is the devil's behind.
That's okay. You do you. It's all good. Joelle, what do you find most meaningful about the work that you do?
I would have to, I think it's probably the accumulation of wisdom that I get offered to me, basically, that I can then take and bring to the next patient and the next family and the next bunch of folks I work with. I love that people let me be there for them. And it's very meaningful to me when a family who's really, really struggling, when I know that they're going to be okay. Like when I know that for all the strife and all of the, if it was a really hard process, when I check in on them a few months later and they're breathing again and they're integrating the loss. They're not getting over it, and nor should they.
Right.
But they're learning to live and with that loss, and they're learning to survive what they felt was going to be unsurvivable.
It's amazing work. We are privileged
It
just
is.
to even be witness to it.
That I get to do this is I feel very fortunate.
Joelle, how can my listeners connect with you?
Well, email, social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I have an email address where I have therapists contact me because they find me, they're looking for bereavement resources and they can't find any in the community. So people reach out to me from all over the place. It would be revjoellejohns@gmail.com, and people are welcome to contact me there. It's revjoellejohns@gmail.com.
Awesome.
And people are welcome to reach out with any questions or, if they want to just talk, I'm here.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the conversation today. It does my heart good every time we get to connect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen. This has been terrific. I really appreciate it.
Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and send your questions or comments by email to me at helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.